Okay, we'll get started. I'm Mary Hunt. This is the Water Talk on Wednesday, November 13th with Dr. Grace Cow. We're talking about her book, My Body, Their Baby, A Progressive View of Surrogacy, Vision for Surrogacy. And I want to start by simply recommending the book. And as I said to Grace earlier, as we were chatting, I see sessions like this as really putting information and knowledge in the bank. And we do this at a liminal time when we need to be thinking not just about the immediate horrors that are playing out in our political scene here in the US, but also down the pike, what this is going to mean for particular people on particular issues, and surrogacy is one of them. Make no mistake. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to Water in Silver Spring, Maryland. I'm Mary Hunt, the co-director with Diane New, who has joined us. And our interns from Germany, Wed Nagy from Bonn and Magdalena Mueller from Thuringia, and they're both here through the Brethren Voluntary Service Program for a year at Water. And they follow in the tradition of other people from that program, as well as others from the Loretto and Mennonite and so forth programs. And these are tremendous people who go on to make a real difference in the world. So we are delighted to have them with us, and also benefit from their wisdom, especially their IT skills and their insights into the U.S. political situation from people who don't live here. So a hearty welcome to them. This is their end of their second month, I guess. October, and now end of your second month. It's been quite a whirlwind for them, and I think a good one. We hope, Grace, that you find yourself at home and that other people do too here at Water. And I want to begin, as we always do, with the land acknowledgement. We've incorporated this into our programs, as many groups have, not to absolve ourselves from any responsibility, but to assume that responsibility. And that's why we begin with the land acknowledgement, to remind ourselves of why we do what we do, and what we need to do more of, given the systemic injustice Indigenous and other people of color face in this country. A land acknowledgement, as I said, is a beginning, not an end, a time to reflect on history and to commit to justice making. We at Water are on Indigenous land in Silver Spring, Maryland, traditional and contemporary land of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples. We acknowledge the trauma and injustice toward those persons and others of color that is so deep in the U.S. culture and history. We join in efforts to eradicate it and to make reparations for the genocide involved. Water's work, whether intellectual, spiritual, or liturgical, is aimed at bringing about social justice. And that's why we take a theme like today's on surrogacy, which is rapidly becoming an issue of social justice. But consider now, for just a quiet collective moment, the Native people on whose land you sit, and feel free, if you wish, to put their names in the chat. Let's just take a moment of silence together to reflect on that reality. Thank you. And again, that's a warm welcome. Water's work brings feminist womanist spiritual values and intellectual work to efforts for social change. Our hope is that by socializing the resources of feminist and womanist work in religion, we spread tools and energy for justice. In light of the recent US elections, we have new insights into how important, I would say how precious, opportunities like this are for learning and conversation. Our goal is to spread the good news well beyond the academic sphere to people all over society who will need to protect spaces and expand spaces like this in the months to come what may. So a warm welcome to everybody, but be clear why we're here. It's both for knowledge as well as for community. It's both an effort at social change and an effort to hold the line. Let me speak about today's format. I'll introduce our speaker and her theme, and then Grace will share her book in which she details her experience as a surrogate and offers a thorough and thoughtful exploration of the ethical issues involved in surrogacy. Then we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. We'll finish at the top of the hour, which will be 2 p.m. here on the East Coast. When we finish the meeting, we will not close off the Zoom for those who wish to stay on for further conversation, but we will Thank you all, and you'll be able to make a graceful exit at the top of the hour. And Grace, if you're willing to stay on a little bit, fine. And if not, we understand you have a busy schedule.
Absolutely, no problem.
Thank you. So I invite all of you to listen and to enjoy. Some people have their lunch during our sessions or their breakfast, depending on where they are. And we will take notes, and Grace will provide us with materials that she's using. So those will be available through the notes that we send out. This video will also be on our website along with the notes. And you can share this with other people. And I suspect several people I can see already will be sharing this with students and others that they work with. And you'll get it by going to the WATER website, www.waterwomensalliance.org. Look under programs and teleconferences, and you'll see a picture of Grace, and or the cover of the book, and then you'll see a link to the video and to the notes, and that'll be up in a couple of days. I want to again highly recommend the book that we're talking about today, and I think if you've had a chance to read it, you know what I'm talking about. My Body, Their Baby: A Progressive Vision for Surrogacy. It's Stanford University Press, 2023, and it is really well worth reading. And it is I'm going to say it this way, it's an easy read. And by that, I don't mean that the issues are not complex, but I mean it's written in a very fluid and accessible way. And that makes it all the more valuable. Some would say dangerous. Let me introduce Grace, and I do so with delight. Welcome you back, Dr. Grace Kao. Happily, you're no stranger to water. You've done other water talks in 2016 on your Introduction to Asian American Ethics book, and in 2019 with Rebecca Todd Peters on your joint book, Encountering the Sacred: Feminist Reflections on Women's Lives. So welcome back, Grace. And this time with My Body, My Baby, I think you've got a fitting combination of sorts of the other two titles. Your analysis of surrogacy combines elements of Asian American ethics, and you describe very sacred encounters with women's reproductive experiences. So we await your exposition on this. Dr. Kao is professor of ethics and the inaugural Bishop Roy Sano Chair in Pacific and Asian American Theology at Claremont School of Theology. And I remember Methodist Bishop Roy Sano from his days as professor and head of the Pacific and Asian American Center for Theology and Strategies at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley. It's wonderful to see that you carry on his name in the work that you do. Grace completed her BA and MA at Stanford and her PhD at Harvard, serves on the board of directors of the Society of Christian Ethics, currently serves on managing boards of the Asia Pacific North American Religions Research Initiative and the Pacific Asian and North American Asian Women in Theology and Ministry, or PAN-AUTUM, a network that we consider to be a dear sister group of water. On a personal note, Dr. Kao is a lay Presbyterian, reporting that she won 5 teaching awards and is also the first Asian American woman to be tenured and promoted to full professor at Claremont School of Theology. This is no small achievement. She lives in Orange County, California, with her husband, her 2 biracial teenage sons, and 1 pandemic cat, as she describes her family. I follow her stunningly talented sons' careers on Facebook, so I know she has a full and busy life. And yesterday, her father celebrated his 80th birthday, huh?
Yes.
It was really quite a do, and family flew in from other parts of the country, and it looked like they all were having a grand time and a beautiful cake and so forth. So congratulations to him. But I think, all the more reason to thank you in advance, Grace, for your work with us today and for your commitment to a progressive Christian vision for surrogacy. And I think that really, that's a subtitle that is not wasted on the work that you're trying to do. And it helps us to understand other complex and increasingly threatened issues using the methodology that you have at least schematically sketched out in this book. And I think that's really helpful. And I want to, if we have time, talk about that a little bit, that it's not just the surrogacy question, but it's how you go about your own methodology for doing this work. So with that bit of introduction, a warm welcome back. And we look forward to hearing your exposition on My Body, Their Baby. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary, and to all the good people at Water. Water has been a supporter of my work. I tune in to sessions, I assign them to my students, so it is a great joy to be here today. I did prepare, I thought I was going to speak off the cuff, and then I thought, okay, well, maybe I should prepare a slide deck. So if you can hang tight for a second, let me just cue that up. Students of mine who are in this audience, current and former students, you will know this is my normal, right, to come organized. So what I thought I'd do today, Mary told me, okay, can you say something for maybe 15 minutes or so, and then we'll go into Q&A. And so what I wanted to do is just to kind of give you an overview of how I came to write the book and the central argument for the book. And then I will gladly receive your questions. So because surrogacy, my story involves my body and it involves another set of friends' infertility experiences. And these tend to be very sensitive and personal matters. And I've found that while I give talks about my book, people have all sorts of questions, but they're just kind of terrified to ask them because they feel like, oh, maybe it's going to be too invasive. But let me tell you that I have probably heard and addressed every question that you have. So please do ask them as they arise. So to begin, I want to acknowledge the fact that as a society, we don't really know what to think about surrogacy. So on the one hand, there is a very common narrative of surrogacy bringing joy. And you see this most in celebrity news and entertainment headlines. And so for those of you who've kept up with these various celebrities, you know, Elton John or Jessica Parker or Nicole Kidman or Anderson Cooper, you know that this is a way that couples or singles or gay men couples have brought a child into the world. So there is that surrogacy brings joy. And sometimes when there are not, when we're not talking about celebrities, you get these occasional personal interest stories. Oh, you know, this heartwarming story of a grandmother who carried her biological grandchild because she was the surrogate for her daughter. So every once in a while in Today or People magazine, we hear stories like this. Now, on the flip side, when we think about surrogacy or when society thinks about surrogacy, they're not thinking of joy. They're thinking nightmare. They're thinking dystopia. They're thinking, you know, the worst possible set of things that could happen. So we have Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, this, you know, breeder class of women who will be gestating the offspring of the rich. If you've kept up with international news, you know that the European Parliament has condemned surrogacy recently. Italy banned surrogacy abroad for couples. In the 1980s, when surrogacy resurfaced in the public consciousness in the US, there were all these articles and talk about, oh, mothers for hire and commodifying pregnancy, right? So there's this notion of dystopian nightmare. You know, Mary references the Pope condemned surrogacy in a talk to diplomats last January. Honestly, this actually surprised me how much traction it got because the Catholic Church has been against all assisted reproductive technology for decades, right? So there was nothing new, and yet this got a lot of traction. So that was in January. So we've got these two sides of surrogacy bringing joy and surrogacy as nightmare. So all of that, I had a sense of that when I myself became a surrogate. So a picture on the left is me in May 2015. This is with white husband and my two biracial sons, who are then 5 and 7. And then on the picture on the right, Christmas 2016, is me postpartum. So in between the picture on the left and the right, I ended up carrying my friend's baby. And I'd be more than happy to share the story of how I came to do that. But the short version was that these were friends of ours who were in a Christian small group, and we knew they were trying to adopt, but they were not successful. They were never picked. And one thing led to another. And then the wife, they had been infertile at this point for 10 years, asked me in so many words, would you carry my child? And I ended up saying yes. So what ended up happening is I was living my life. Mary has mentioned, I'm a professor. I've been, teaching my students, writing my books, going to conferences. And I then started moving around in 2016 as a very visibly pregnant 40-year-old. And this caught a lot of people by surprise. And I had a zillion questions of, oh my God, Grace, I didn't know you were pregnant. What? You want a third child? And I would always say, I would receive their congratulations. And I would say some version of, oh, thank you, I'm doing fine. But actually the third child isn't for me, it's actually for a set of friends. And you could imagine the range of reactions I would get from people, right? They would be like, oh my God, some would say, oh, that's so nice, what a gift, that's so beautiful. Others would say, oh my, well, what are your kids? Are you telling your kids? What does your husband think? Like they would have all sorts of reactions. And so when I would share my reactions, my academic friends ended up asking me some version of, well, have you ever thought about writing? Have you ever thought about chronicling your experiences of surrogacy? Because they knew I was a feminist theological ethicist. They knew that I had the capacity to do research, in this area. And so basically that's what I ended up doing. In the course of my study, I came across a book by Elizabeth Kane. This is a pseudonym. She is America's first known surrogate. This is before Mary Beth Whitehead. And she has this passage where she says, infertility isn't exactly cocktail party talk, but as soon as anyone finds out the details of my pregnancy, they feel free to tell me the most intimate details of their lives. And this absolutely was my experience. So as I moved about in the world as a visibly pregnant woman, there were women in particular I would encounter who I might not even have been close to them, but they would share their own infertility struggles or that of someone they knew. And there were a fraction of women who would just start crying. They were either moved by what I was doing, or, they just, were shocked or thinking about their own infertility struggles or what it takes to bring a child into the world. And then a number of folks had other concerns. So just to contextualize my experience, I was what's called a gestational surrogate, meaning the child I carried was not biogenetically my own child. I did not use my eggs. That means I had to get pregnant through IVF. The other kind of surrogacy is so-called traditional, where the only way to get pregnant is through artificial insemination or through sexual intercourse. So gestational surrogacy today probably takes up 95 to 99% of all surrogacies in the world. The next set of images is the piggy bank versus the gift. And my surrogacy was a gift, meaning I did not charge my friends. A lot of concern about surrogacy today is not so much on the gift, but on payment. And so we'll talk about that later on today. Surrogacy is something that does not have any federal regulations, and it is legislated in the US state by state. I didn't know it then, but as a resident of California, California is actually understood to be the surrogacy capital of the world. There are a high number of fertility clinics. Again, I reference the celebrities who seem to be turning to surrogacy. There is birthright tourism for some folks in the Pacific Rim. There are more permissive attitudes about queer couples. So there are all sorts of reasons why California is seen as the surrogacy capital of the world. The industry and also the laws, because California will allow the eligibility requirements for being a surrogate are pretty minimal. It's not that you have to be a heterosexual couple, right? And it's also not that you need to have a medical need. Other places, you must be a heterosexual married couple, or you must have a documented medical need, for instance. And there was also no ceiling on compensation. Okay, in this last graphic of this world, there are also no global regulations on surrogacy, but it is a global concern. Globally, the trend is toward prohibition. So Mary, you referenced Italy's recent ban on parents going abroad to conceive their children. So the trend is toward prohibition, although in the US with various states, the trend is opposite. It's toward opening up former restrictions. So that's just contextualizing my experience a little bit. So I've written this book. So for all these reasons, I felt like I had something to contribute. I wanted to address some widespread misperceptions and stereotypes about surrogacies. And I had my own interests. So I ended up writing this book. It came out last year. In chapter number 2, this question about psychological harm. The most common question, aside from people congratulating me, oh, that's fantastic that you're carrying your friend's baby. The most common question that people asked me was, aren't you scared you're going to grow attached this baby and not want to give the baby up at the end? And even in the postpartum period, I've given birth, the baby is now with the parents. People would ask, do you still see this baby? And they would always be shocked that I would say, yes, yeah, we're still in the same small group, right? Because the assumption was that separation would be traumatic. The research, though, doesn't show that. The research shows that women who agree to have other people's babies end up bonding with the intended parents, not with the baby. And I can talk a little bit more about that as well. Under chapter 3, does surrogacy violate distinctive feminist or Christian commitments? On the left, so there's a wing of feminists so-called radical feminists, who are against the medicalization of pregnancy in general. And so, of course, they're not interested in ART. But there's, let's say, left-leaning concerns about the relationship between surrogacy laws and abortion laws. So there were some concerns there. And in Christian concerns, you had folks who were worried about the wealth disparities in payment cases, or they were worried about, well, why do you have to do IVF/surrogacy? Why can't infertile couples just adopt? So I address questions like these. And then in chapters 4, 5, and 6, I build my argument. Mary, you had asked about, can I address some of the methodological ways I do so? And so what I do in the book is I say, I'm starting with some foundational assumptions that some people are just gonna completely disregard. So for instance, if you're coming from the Catholic tradition that affirms the inseparability thesis, where you can never separate sex from reproduction, then there's nothing I can say in this book that will convince you, right? If you are coming from the perspective that experience is not really something that you should be taking seriously, you should be looking at all these cautionary tales of surrogacy in the Bible, then my leaning on 4 decades of research on surrogacy is not going to be convincing to you either. So the types of traditions that I'm looking at are a number of mainline Protestant denominational statements about a number of things. So what are those things? Number one, a number of mainline Protestant denominations have said children parenthood and children are good for those vocationally called to parenthood. So it's not children are a requirement of marriage, It's not necessarily pronatalism. Not everyone is destined to be a parent. These mainline denominations have also said that adoption and IVF are permissible alternatives for those who cannot conceive naturally. These mainline and Protestant denominations have also said that same-sex couplings are equally good, equally beautiful as opposite-sex ones. And so what I do in the book is build out from these commitments. I do so here, although I want to be mindful of the time because I'm already at 15 minutes. So I start with a series of
Grace, you're
commitments.
fine. Just keep right on going. I think the
Okay,
input is
that's okay.
extremely, yes, input is, people with me on that, the input is extremely helpful. So go right
Okay,
ahead. Yeah.
great, great. Okay. So knowing, knowing that these are the commitments that, so I'm a lay Presbyterian, how do I build the argument? Well, let's start with the queer case. And for surrogacy, it's usually gay male couples. So you've already said that two men being covenantally partnered or married is as good as beautiful as one man, one woman, or two women. And if we are truly believing this notion of equality, we've also said that children are a traditional good or end of marriage. This goes back to St. Augustine. So the question is, well, what then do you do with the fact that two men cannot, until reproductive technology changes, produce a baby? Because in the heterosexual case, you have already said IVF is a possible route, and you've said adoption is a possible route. So you've given the option of reproductive tech for the heterosexual couple, but are you going to bar it for the case of the same-sex couple? I would say that that is unjust to do so. That's not true equality. If there's only one path to parenthood for a queer couple, but potentially three paths to parenthood for a heterosexual couple. And so my proposal is to allow for the reproductive generosity of another person. Now, to say that it could be morally illicit is not to say that each and every surrogacy arrangement necessarily will be. And so what I do in a later chapter of the book is spell out a series of ethical principles. How do we form and arrange these relationships in an ethical manner? And I give a series of principles. Now, all of that takes place in a context where, to simplify the argument, I have assumed we're talking about gestational arrangements. Oh, sorry. I've assumed my slider is sliding too quickly. I've assumed that we're talking about a couple. I've assumed that the law is not prohibited. I'm assuming informed consent, all of these things, right? So I get to these principles. I'd be, again, happy to unpack them. But in more complex cases, not all those assumptions hold, right? In some cases, surrogacies are compensated. In some cases, surrogacies cross borders. And so it's, a French couple contracting with a Canadian woman, or, an Israeli couple contracting with a woman from California or whatever. And in some cases, the surrogacies are traditional. And so what I do in the book is then address the concerns that arise from that. With compensated surrogacies, you can imagine the concerns have to do with exploitation. There are concerns about the racial impact, and there are concerns about commodification. And what I do in the book is address these concerns one by one, some with some acknowledgement. So for instance, all these fears about the racial impact, they're inconclusive because there is no international tracking. But we do know in the studies that have been done in Canada, UK, Australia, and the US, that white people are actually overrepresented on both sides of the equation as intended parents and as surrogates. And then you also have these really interesting cases where sometimes the races are reversed. So for instance, China is one of the top sending countries of intended parents. And some of that has to do with the legacy of the one-child policy that started to be repealed in the early 2010s. But then, older people only had one child, but now they want another, but they're encountering infertility. And so you have these wealthy Chinese couples coming to the US, and a number of them have a preference for white surrogate women. So the racial dynamic is actually reversed to the model that many people have. And then again, I give a series of ways to address other concerns. I do the same thing for cross-border surrogacies, where I argue that in some cases, we're not talking about reproductive tourism, we're talking about reproductive exiles. Most people want to have their reproductive needs met at home, but in many cases, they're blocked because of laws or affordability or other concerns. And then I also address the case of traditional surrogacies. So that is my book in a nutshell. And as I mentioned, I am happy to unpack things. I'm happy to take your questions, or Mary, if you wanted to do a bit of Q&A first from you.
Thank you so very much, Grace. Again, I want to mention the name of the book so that people are clear what we're talking about. It is My Body, Their Baby, a progressive Christian vision for surrogacy. And Dr. Grace Kao has just described, I think very thoroughly and synthetically, the contents of the book. And I'm really grateful for that. It's a complicated and it's a very important issue for which I am sure there are multiple views, including among us here on this conversation. And I especially appreciate, Grace, your being so careful to take seriously the objections to surrogacy and to deal with them with what I consider to be very cogent arguments. I'm also grateful for your willingness to extend your analysis and your ethical methodology so that it can become a model for people working on other issues as well. I want to recommend to people that we will not only have the notes from Grace's talk available, but also a really terrific study guide, a reading and study discussion guide that she's put together. And with your permission, Grace, we will share that with people because I think that really does, in another fashion, what you've just done today. And I found that very, very helpful in my own thinking. So we can turn now to the questions and discussions. I would just raise two questions, just two areas that I think would be interesting to and important to talk about. And one is the question of reproductive justice as an approach to surrogacy. And
Yes.
I think this is very important and you didn't mention it, and that's why I'm picking up on it, because I think it's really a cornerstone to what you're doing in this project. I couldn't agree with you more that surrogacy needs to be one of the options in a reproductive justice approach. And I wonder if you could just describe for folks who might not know the important distinctions that we're talking about here, the difference between a sort of classical pro-choice approach and a reproductive justice approach, because I think that difference is really important in terms of what you're doing. Clearly, the community dimension of reproductive justice is key, and the vulnerability of women of color in a racist society makes it imperative that safeguards be built in. But are there other aspects to highlight, especially for those who might not be familiar with reproductive justice? So if you'd like to
Yeah.
discuss, I think that would also kind of flesh out things a little bit here as to why there's some new thinking, especially among feminists, on this question.
Yes.
You highlighted the Janice Raymond crowd in terms of some of the what I would call now traditional opposition to surrogacy. But what are among especially reproductive justice folks, and particularly women of color who have pioneered that, I think, very important framework? What's going on there that's really central to your discussion of surrogacy?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So RJ as a movement started in the 1990s in reaction to the Cairo Population Development Conference and also Clinton's plans for healthcare reform. And there are 12 pioneering women who felt, as you mentioned, the pro-choice paradigm, where the focus was just, let's get a set of laws in place They felt like that was insufficient because the concern was access, not necessarily legality, right? If you have laws that allow for contraception or allow for abortion, but you still have barriers for people getting them or comprehensive sex education, et cetera, then that's not going to be practical. So the movement crystallized in the 1990s, and there have been various pillars of RJ. It's reproductive justice as a blend of the human rights framework and social justice. There is a commitment for everyone to have the right to have the child, everyone's right to not have a child, and then everyone's right to parent the child they have in safe and healthy environments. So what's interesting is that the RJ movement has not yet reached a consensus on surrogacy. I think this is actually similar to the mainstream pro-choice movement that also has not reached a consensus. What I'm arguing is that this principle, this bedrock principle of trusting women, right, to determine whether to have a pregnancy or to terminate a pregnancy for themselves, it should be the same thing to extend it to have a pregnancy for someone else, right? That the concern is paternalism. When everyone under the sun said, Grace, aren't you terrified that you're going to grow attached to the child and not want to give it up? People have these assumptionless understandings of what pregnancy does to a person. And that's not necessarily borne out from the diversity of experiences. Some people absolutely love their 3-day zygote or whatever, even before they knew they were pregnant because they were so excited. Other people had experience of alienation after birth, and it was only through weeks and months and years maybe of forming a relationship. So for me, the trust women principle is a connecting piece. The other thing I'll say, Mary, to answer your question, I actually did a video with Dr. Toni Bond, who's one of the 12 pioneering women of the RJ movement. And she had expressed not only the point I made earlier that there's no consensus, but that the concern was the other way. It's not that Black women would be exploited, it's that Black women would not be permitted a chance to be a part of the surrogacy market. Because we all know that there is a correlation between class and health, right? And the best way to have a healthy baby is to have a healthy uterine environment. The best way to have a healthy uterine environment is to be yourself a healthy person. And so the concern that she expressed was, well, if we have these surrogacy markets, which we do have, Black women would not be viable candidates. Not that they would be exploited, but that they wouldn't be in.
Yeah, we can talk all day about this, and because I think it's really important. But I wanted to simply lift that up because I think that
Thank you.
moving your argument, seeing that your argument moves out of that framework, I think it really is very helpful. The other thing that I'd like to talk about, and we don't need to do it now, we can circle back to it at the end, but just to put it in your mind as you answer other people's questions, is
Okay.
given the new dispensation, that is to say, after January 2025. I'm just wondering how you see surrogacy coming under specific fire, especially in states like California, where it is well entrenched legally. Is a national ban possible? And what does that international ban for people in Italy mean for folks who want to come here? So we may be getting a little in the weeds there, but just to keep that in the back of your mind, because I think
Yes.
all of us are reeling post-election. And especially now as we see the picks for the cabinet posts and extras, let's say,
That's right.
mention names of Elon and pals, but this is seems to me one of those issues that would be ripe for the picking for some of these efforts that would upgrade and give some of the anti-abortion people some more work to do. So
Yes.
they could make themselves anti-surrogacy and keep busy that way. So I think there are those kinds of considerations. So you might want to comment briefly, but let's come back to it and let's open it up for other people.
Okay.
Is that okay? Yeah. But I just want people to know that that's very much in my mind, and I think very much on the mind of folks. So the floor is open for Q&A, discussion, comments, anything you'd like to say in conversation with Grace. And again, thank you for being here. Let me simply recommend that you use the raise hands button reactions frame below, and you simply press the button, and it puts you not only in the top of my queue, but it lets us see you're interested in talking. And then when you finish, you just drop your hand, and that's the end of that. So let me suggest that you give your name and maybe where you're from as you ask your question or make your comment. I know that there are folks who want to do that. So the floor is open. Anybody? It's a new topic for, I think, lots of people, and on a hard one. Yes, Adriana?
Um,
We
thank
can't
you.
see you, but we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My internet is not stable, so I keep the video off to help with the
Totally acceptable.
sound.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Gao. Thank you for the elaboration you put on in a very short time about your book. I'm just, as a mother, I'm just wondering about your experience of the bonding. You said you bond with the parent, not the child. So can you kindly share more about that, and how it reflects your relationship with the child that you gave birth to? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Adriana, for the question. So when people asked me, aren't you terrified? Aren't you scared? I would tell them I have no fear that I would bond with the child. And the reason why I had no fear and total confidence that I wouldn't is because I did not bond with my own children, 2 of them, while I was carrying them. I felt very responsible for them. I was excited about my pregnancy, but they were strangers to me, and I gave birth to my first, and I grew to love him over weeks and months. And so my kids are 2 years apart. And so when I was pregnant with my second one, I legitimately wondered, can I love another human being as much as I love this one? Is it possible? I legitimately did not know. Then I was pregnant with number 2, gave birth to him, fell in love with him, but it was a process. So what the literature shows is that a number of women are like me, that if you've done the psychologically screening correctly, you would only select surrogates who already feel like their family is complete. And what ends up happening is that they become very invested in the project. They get to know the intended parents. In this case, I already knew them. They were already my friends. And, I did not want a third child. I very much wanted them to have their first child. And you share your, I text my friend, oh, I woke up feeling dizzy today. And she'd say, hooray, or, whatever. So you develop this very, very close and intimate relationship. So it was just not difficult for me to give back the baby. And again, this is mostly born, my experience is mostly reflected in the literature. There were some tragic cases in the 1980s when the public first came to learn about surrogacy. These were traditional surrogates, where the baby was biologically of the mom. And there were absolutely some difficult separation cases. But for the vast majority, it's not the trauma that people think it would be.
Thank you very much for the question and for this very candid answer. I also loved your honesty in the book about saying when someone asked you, would you do this again?
Yeah.
And you very, very quickly said, no, absolutely not. And it wasn't because it was a bad experience. It was because at your age, you didn't think that it would be a good thing for you or therefore for the baby's well-being. And I thought that was just a very lovely thing and a very appropriate way to think about it. And I just wondered, it was also asked of the intended parents, would they do it again? And I just wondered, would they have they completed their family now, or are they interested in another child, or I don't
I
you don't
think,
need to file the
yes,
comment, but just if that's an appropriate question.
that's right. So they have, for the record, they have no more embryos. So if they were to do it again, it would be a whole process. And this child is now, so child was born in 2016. So I think their family is complete. They certainly haven't asked me to do it again. But back to my dad, who just celebrated 80. Oh my God, my parents were terrified the entire time I was pregnant, because an IVF pregnancy is a high-risk pregnancy, right?
Yeah.
And so just even for their sake alone, I could not put them through that again.
Well, and gestational age is such an important issue. I mean, you
Yes.
make that very clear. So I just like the candidness of it and the frankness of it, and the very, yes, it was a great experience. No, I wouldn't do it again, but not because it wasn't a good experience. So
Yeah.
you're
Thank
living
you.
your own thing. Let's go to Judith, and then we'll continue. Judith, go ahead. We don't see you, Judith. There you are.
There you
Welcome.
are.
Judith Plaskow.
I think she's looking for the unmute.
Maybe Wed, can you unmute her, or maybe we can can we unmute her, Magdalena or Wed? She's having trouble with that.
It looks like she's not.
Ask her to unmute. Yeah, there we go.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
There we are. Hey, Judith.
Hi, Judith. We see your lips moving, but I'm not hearing audio.
Yeah, we're not getting audio from you.
Maybe could you type your question in the chat? Maybe we could do that.
That's a great idea.
Okay, and we'll take Ayudeli's question in.
Yeah.
first.
Ayudeli, why don't you go ahead, and then Judith, if you get your sound figured out, we'll come back to you. Ayudeli, please go ahead. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gao and everyone. Well, usually my angle to a matter as this is as a pastor in the church. I know I was just discussing with my wife shortly before this meeting that I will be on a platform where my professor will be sharing about her book. And I was also telling her, we're having, a mature conversation. We have a democratic home where he has us here, I have my say, and we try to have a middle ground where we can just blend together. There are people in the church. If I go to my context now, Nigeria, in my context, this is totally foreign or kind of strange. But lately, we are seeing people who now they have 2 children, like twins, triplets, and all of that through IVF in Nigeria currently now. And these people had waited for like 10, 20. I know one of our leaders in my church who they waited for 25 years. But that miracle happened, miracle of science, okay? So, and I started wondering, like someone, who cannot even have their own children. I know some families in church who will come for counseling and prayers. And I wish I had known these before then to just share with them. But these are devout Christians who would want anything they will do to be biblical. And I was just sharing with my wife that was what happened to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Gao, if I could share that with anyone, that Mary also was a kind of surrogate mother who carried Jesus, not from, if you understand what I'm trying to say, because I really want to share something that is biblical, that my own people in my context can relate with. What you have done is a goodness to humanity, which as a person, I'm okay with that. But is this correct? Is this the same thing like what Mary did?
Yes. So
go ahead, Grace. Thank you very much for your question. Thank you so much, and glad you're with us. Go ahead, Grace.
I was going to say, so I'd be happy to speak with you offline about Mary's interesting birth experience. But yes, in the surrogacy literature, people talk about Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Jacob, Leah, Rachel, Ruth, and Mary. So I'd be more than happy to share those those resources offline.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Judith, did you get a sound there? No? Okay, and let's go then to your question.
And just, yes. Do you want me to say it out loud? Would it help? One of
Yeah,
the
Judith
things
says,
on-
sorry, my mic isn't working. 2 questions. What are the figures on gift surrogacy versus surrogacy that involves payment? That's one. And the second, she's interested in hearing you speak about economic inequality and surrogacy. On the one hand, absolutely trust women. On the other hand, profoundly unjust world economy puts some women in a situation of having no other ways to earn a living. So those are 2 very important questions. And Judith, I'm sorry we can't hear them from you, but I hope that having them in the chat's okay. So Grace, the
Yeah.
first one, the statistics, and then the second one, the question of inequality.
Yes. So in the Western countries where surrogacy is legal, so in Canada, sorry, putting US aside, Canada, Australia, surrogacies cannot be commercial, but that does not mean compensation cannot happen. So the UK defines commercial as advertising, marketing, recruiting, but you can compensate. This is why the distinction between commercial versus gift is a little bit complicated. I think worldwide, the vast majority of folks receive some sort of compensation. Now, whether that falls under the rubric of commercial is another question. Okay, so that's that first. The second, yes, trust women only works under conditions of informed consent. And absolutely, there are going to be a range of options for one person in one context that will be different for another. The concern I have, because if you look at some Indian sociology, so once upon a time, India used to be the surrogacy center of the world. People went there because the laws were lax and the rates seemed to be very inexpensive. And for a series of reasons, beginning in the 2010s, now surrogacy is not prohibited. Sorry, it's not allowed. But if you look at what some sociologists are seeing, they are saying that in some cases, women prefer surrogacy work over other alternatives, meaning they prefer that to working at a factory or going late night to some other job. And in some cases, the women are earning more this is in the past, but they were earning more money than they would if they took regular wage employment. And in some cases, more money than their husbands would ever receive. And that then changes the power dynamic. So my deep concern is that if people have an attitude, oh, if you're only doing surrogacy for the money, and therefore it's not true consent, then you have to reach the conclusion, well, then that means these poor women can't consent to anything. They can't consent to work in a sweatshop. They can't consent to work in another factory. And I think there's a real danger of thinking of poor women as having agency like this. Yeah, and I'd be happy to expand upon those points, but I know we're like getting close on time.
Yeah, Judith, if you want to respond, you can certainly put it in the chat. But I think, you're putting your finger on a very difficult problem here, especially in the second question. And Grace, I appreciate your insight in this, really helpful. But just in a more gum-chewing way, the extent to which racism and economic disparities really condition things so thoroughly, as it were, globally and thoroughly in this world in which we find ourselves. And is there any possibility for the conditions of consent, and is there any possibility for really approaching this in a way that has this slightest semblance of justice for everybody involved? And that's where I think your book is really important, because you don't try to answer that question precisely, but you give us a lot of tools for talking about it. And I want to say again how very much I appreciate that, and certainly recommend the book highly for that reason, because it has made me think some new ways about some things that I hadn't thought about before. I also had the experience of being with you at the AAR when we had the conversation. I've been thinking about this even since then. Last year, I guess, or was it 2 years ago? Whatever it was. Anyway, I want to move on to Mary Jane, and then we'll finish up with Carrie, so make them quick, because we want to finish at 2. Or you know what we might do? Why don't we go to Mary Jane, and then Carrie, if you can stay past 2, we'll finish, and then we'll continue with your question, because I know there are others. Mary Jane, go ahead.
I'm interested in the nature versus nurture discussion. Have any studies been, is surrogacy determined to be nurture rather than nature?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Do you mean, are you talking about the maternal?
Whether people are acting from nature or from the way they were raised?
In becoming a surrogate, you mean?
No, in being the result of a surrogacy, in the infants that are born, and in their later life, is surrogacy considered nature or is it considered nurture? Does
So,
anybody know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about?
I think maybe let me take a stab at it, Mary Jane. I think maybe what Mary Jane's trying to ask, Grace, is given the nature nurture discussion in general, what is, if there's any research, and there may not be yet, but what is the research that shows which or how those two elements come together in terms of the experience of the person? How does the person who, for example, in the case of your surrogacy, how does that little girl? I know,
Yeah.
I know your sons call her mother Auntie, which I thought was lovely. So
Yeah.
there's a family connection there. But how does she,
Gotcha.
how does the little girl relate to you? And is it was that period of that 9-month gestation understood as nature, kind of the natural experience of that, or was it a nurturing? Is it on the nurturing side of the equation? I'm not sure that the nature nurture is exactly the right frame there, but I think you get an idea of what Mary Jane
Sure.
get at. Yeah, is that Mary Jane?
Yes.
Does that do justice to it?
I'll respond in this way. So in the surrogacy literature, a lot surrogacy researchers are drawing upon research in ART, where there's been a donor conception, and research on adoption. And in both cases, we have much more literature, because people have been having donor conceived children. And there have been studies of this for far longer. We have studies up to surrogate born children up to about 20. And so far, the findings are that there are better psychological outcomes for all if there is not secrecy, not concealment, but truth. So the surrogate born child comes to know their origins, comes to know, I was not raised in this mother's womb, but this other person's womb. So we're seeing things like that. At this point, for me directly, this child knows who I am. She calls me tummy mummy, which is something that comes from like the British, which I think is very adorable. And I think it remains to be seen how the relationship will continue, right? But the best results from these studies is for openness and honesty, if that helps.
Great. Mary Jane, thanks for the question. It's one that really pushes us all to think in new ways about this as well. I want to bring our formal session to a close by thanking you, Grace, so much for this wonderful resource, My Body, Their Baby, a progressive Christian vision for surrogacy. And I recommend it to people. I think, dive into it, read it with a group of trusted friends with whom you can have clear and frank conversation about how you feel about this issue. Expect that it will be on the political agenda forthcoming. And I want to thank all of you for being farsighted enough to join this crucial conversation. You'll get a link to the video and to the notes, and we'll include Grace's enormously helpful and generous reading and discussion guide, which is really the heart of what she said today, augmented, of course, by these wonderful slides. Let me talk about water future programs. One will be a ritual on the 19th, which is Tuesday, the 19th at 7:30 p.m. with Diane New and the water community on peace of the changing seasons. As the seasons change, we will be looking at what it means to give thanks for the insights we've received and to look at the grounds around us as we change. The next water program after that will be on meditation on December the 2nd. These are both at 7:30 in the evening Eastern time, and it'll be with Kate Moody on the theme of inner light as we focus on strategies for cultivating and connecting with inner light during these seasons of change. And then the next water talk in this series will be on Wednesday, December the 4th at 1 p.m. Eastern time, same as this hour, with our dear Susan Brooks Thistlethwaite on her new book, Surfacing, one of her Christian Janelli mystery books, dealing with fear and trauma post the election. And Susan Brooks Thistlethwaite, if you don't know her, is a well-known and highly regarded theological educator who has, in her retirement, turned to, among other things, very full plate, but among other things, writing mystery novels and raising very difficult contemporary issues through a format that many people who do not read theological books, with all due respect to Grace,
Yes.
to those present who do, but who read mysteries. And so this book, Surfacing, is just a terrific one, part of her Kristen Janelli's mystery. And Kristen Janelli, of course, is the main character whose exploits we follow through these mystery novels. So those are upcoming water programs. You're welcome to all of them. They're also going to be on our website. Our programs are free. They're open to everyone. Your donations are needed and welcome. But our point is to socialize resources. So those who can donate, as Grace did so generously with her time today, makes it possible for everyone to be involved. And we have some very, as you know, some very generous donors. And we have a belief at Water that if we share among us, there's enough. If we share among us, there's enough. And I can attest to 40 years of doing that. And among us, there's more than plenty. But it's contingent on our sharing. And so thank you very much for those who are able to do it. And for those who are not able to share, especially financial resources, you are more than welcome anyway. There's no, I don't even know who does what. You're more than welcome anyway. And we really appreciate your being part of us. So let me thank you once again, Grace, and all who joined. And I'm going to continue the conversation with Carrie Roach, who's been waiting patiently. So strength and power to everyone in these challenging times. But let's see if we have a few other things to pick up here. Carrie, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just want to first thank you for broaching this subject. And I'm bringing to the space my graduate practicum work in the late 1980s, directed by Dr. Mercedes Iannone and Institute of Pastoral Ministry. My practicum was working in supporting transitional sheltering, permanent supportive housing for unhoused pregnant women who usually were impregnated by family members. So I just wanted to name what happened with the women I worked with. Many times were paid to get sterilized after they. So this is just another aspect,
another piece of the puzzle.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Right.
just and I'm still shocked. I'm still, it still hurts me that that's how they thought of women and how they thought of their commodification to me, that they would pay them off like that. So that I'm very interested in your work. Did you mention that, or did you bring that part into your book?
So I didn't speak specifically about forced sterilization, but there's this larger principle. I mean, the concern is financial inducements
Yes.
in reproductive matters that you might not have chosen had you had other options. This is the concern that Judith put on the table. That's right.
Yes.
And you're absolutely right. There are particular communities that have been subject to forced sterilization campaigns because there were beliefs that these communities should not be reproducing. So even these are larger social justice principles about who are the types of people we want to help with fertility, who are the types of people that society says, no, we want to discourage. Yeah, so there are absolutely racial and class dimensions. And I would say all of that has to be considered when we're talking about surrogacy or any other matter. And I do think that the RJ framework can speak to that, right?
Yes, extremely important. We need to get that information out there.
Mhm.
And you
Thank
did it. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thanks, Carrie. Always good to have you here. Diane New, you have a question, comment?
Yeah, Grace, thanks so much. My question is a ritual question. I remember in the 80s when abortion was one of the major taboos, several of us worked at creating rituals. You are not alone, helping women face their choices. So how's ritual a piece of your work? And how can it be?
Yes, I mean, thank you for the question. I would love church communities to accept surrogate born children and
Yeah.
be a cause of celebration. I want to normalize 3-parent families, So yes, and the church has an opportunity to do that through baptism, through child dedication. Even the handover in the birthing room can be ritualized. It is and has been for some. Again, to counter this narrative of trauma, which comes from a place of concern. I think it's misguided, but it obviously it comes from a place of concern. There are ways to celebrate the handover that can be ritualized. So yeah, Diane, we need people thinking about that dimension. For sure.
Great. Diane, I'm glad it's on your radar because I do think it is a neglected area and will help to address exactly what you've been talking about in terms of this notion that, well, and it's not just a notion, but the shaming of people and
Yes.
once the choice has been made, I think it's, these are the kinds of things where, once people have made a choice, even if you don't like it, it's very important, especially for the question that Mary Jane raised about the child, to be
Yes.
affirmative. So to have ways of building some, and within the Christian tradition, I suppose it could be connected with baptism, but it might be something else. I
Mhm.
don't think the Christian tradition has an answer to a lot of things that there are other answers to. I think this is, no, really, and I don't
Yes.
think we should, look to it for something it doesn't have, but I think that
Yeah.
this whole idea of ritualizing would add to not only the normalizing of families that are constructed through surrogacy, but also normalizing the experience for the child and
Yes.
telling the story of their welcome and telling, what a lovely way to be able to share that in a story mode with children over time.
And I will say this, and this is tied, I think, to the nature nurture question about the surrogate born children. I would say that it's only been in the last maybe 5 years where parents who've used IVF have been increasingly public about it, right? That used to be this thing that you just don't tell anyone, you just pretend, whatever. But for various reasons, parents are now claiming and owning it. And so I would imagine it might take a little bit longer because surrogacy right now remains the most controversial way of bringing a child into the world. But we've had IVF since 1978, right? So,
Right.
and how long did it take for, the Obamas and the Tim Waltzes and Mike Pences, the world to say, hey, actually, this is how we had our child.
Yeah, and speaking of some of these individuals, maybe circle back to my question from earlier, my comment
Yes.
earlier. What do you see here? And it's not a crystal ball anymore. I mean, what do you
Yes.
see
So the
on the
biggest
horizon?
thing, well, I think the biggest thing will be about IVF, not so much about surrogacy, but it'll be the impact of IVF and the impact of abortion laws, meaning cross-state surrogacies will become a little bit more dangerous if you're talking about a I'm just going to use a shorthand. It doesn't work so well, but a blue state versus a red state, right? A blue state, red state cross-border surrogacy might be it might be increasingly precarious. I think we might see a rise in folks doing PGD, preconception genetic testing or diagnosis, because one of the there are a number of reasons why folks miscarry. One is chromosomal abnormalities, and some of those can be detected even before the transfer. But if we're in a surrogacy arrangement where the intended parents would want the surrogate to terminate if they found out about an abnormality, again, we're dealing with very sensitive things right now. But if that surrogate is in a state where termination has to happen in X number of weeks, or it doesn't happen at all, then you're probably going to see a rise in, okay, let's do the before the transfer, let's test these 3 or 5 day-old embryos. When Pope Francis was on to, not saying that I think he was right, but he was on to something when he called for a global ban, because a national ban is not going to work. What people do is you close one set of doors, people move offshore. You close down India, they go to Nepal. You close down Nepal, they go to Thailand, right? You close down this place, they go elsewhere, right? And that then is the danger of the type of thing that Judith was asking about. I think, and this is where the connection to sex work actually can be made, that a number of people who are doing sex work advocacy are saying, actually, if you want to protect the workers, you don't ban, because you just drive the practices underground. You put in regulations. And I would say that I've come to see that is how surrogacy works. A local ban does not end the practice. It just drives it underground. It just increases the stigma. So yes, I don't have a crystal ball, Mary, but you can imagine, especially now with these fetal personhood bills, and I could go on and on about this, but some of them are crazy, where you can destroy an embryo, but it's not called an abortion because abortion is defined as terminating a pregnancy. So in some cases, IVF is still permissible, even if abortion is not. I mean, it makes sense, does not make sense medically, but it makes sense in the minds of these legislatures.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm more suspicious or pessimistic even than you are about this. I would see this would be, pardon the pun, but a fertile ground for the very conservative approaches to both abortion and IVF, to say, well, and look at what really happens. That we have, it's not bad enough that we have that the people use IVF, which most people don't say anymore. But it's not bad enough that people have abortions, which a lot of people say. But now look what's happening as yet another kind of way of making a separation between the choices that people make, which I think are, in many instances, as you've described, perfectly legitimate choices, and the freedom to make those choices, and the necessity to make those choices, and to square that up with the fact that you want to have many religions that ground that kind of thinking are the ones that want to have as many children as the Lord sends.
Right.
So just got here a little differently, dear. So, but I mean, this is what I mean. The contradiction. It's the contradiction makes obvious that the issue at hand is really to stop women, especially, from having choices about the things that this is mostly women are involved in here, although, as you point out delicately in the book, other persons as well. But these are the kinds of concerns that I have, that I think we need to be looking ahead to. I don't mean to be seeding them for those who want to cause the problems, but I mean that's how that's the logical conclusion of that kind of thinking. Just as they cannot say now, I would think that the Pope, instead of saying, this is something to ban, blah 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 blah, would say, well, here's another way in which we can conceive human life and bring to fruition, blah blah. It seems to me I could ghost for him a very very Catholic sounding positive approach to this question.
You sure could, Mary.
Because it's absolutely the case that if you want all the children the Lord sends, and you think that you don't want people using birth control and you don't want them having abortions, and then they want to be surrogates. Where's the problem here? I just
Yeah.
haven't, it seems to me that that's exactly, as technology makes it possible, what you would be arguing for. So
Yes,
anyway.
you would think that, but so there's this law in the UK where if you've got these cryopreserved embryos, they can only be in storage for 5 years. So
Right.
at a certain point, they were about to be destroyed. And all of these Italian women were, fretting about this. And they said, well, just transfer them to me. I'll carry them basically as a surrogate. And in so many words, the hierarchy has said, I'm sorry, the hundreds and thousands of cryopreserved embryos we have in storage tanks, that is a problem without a solution, that there is no morally licit way to transfer those embryos stuck in stasis and still be good, with
Right,
Catholic.
and that shows you that the issue is not about the embryos. The issue is
Exactly, it
about
really
women and
isn't.
women making
You
choices.
cannot separate sex from reproduction.
No. And
cannot.
you're absolutely right, and I wanted to point that out too in terms of your methodology. But you're absolutely right that there are conversations we can't have.
Yeah.
And to go down, the rabbit hole with people for whom the question of the unitive understanding of sex and reproduction is there's just no conversation to be had there. So
Yep.
yeah. Anybody else a final comment? Water office, anybody? Did you have no? All
Thank
right.
you. Just thank you for stretching our minds, telling your story, and trusting us with your background and research and experience.
Yes, and we'll look forward to your next project, Grace. You have a home here to showcase it, and I'm very sure that people will be using this video with our conversation, and we're going to keep all of it if it's okay with you. We
Absolutely.
we often stop it at the time of the formal ending of the program, but I think our conversation is very useful and
Okay.
will be instructive. And I hope your students, welcome again to your students and
Yes.
thank you for being with us, and all good wishes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank
All
you
right.
all.
Take
Best
care now.
wishes. Yep.
Just send us those materials and we'll be all set.
Absolutely. Okay.
All
Take care,
righty. Take good care
everyone.
now. Thanks. Have a
Bye-bye.
great day.